To celebrate 50 years of lens manufacturing, Samyang have recently released an updated version of their first ever AF lens, the Samyang 50mm f.1.8 Mark II FE. But can this refreshed 50mm stand up to the very popular Zeiss 55mm f.1.8? Well, today we're going to find out. By having a wider maximum aperture of f1.4, the Samyang is obviously going to be the larger and heavier option of these two lenses. But that said, for an f1.4 lens, it really isn't that heavy at all. And this is mainly because it's predominantly made from what appears to be a composite material rather than opting for a solid metal build. Now, this lens is fully weather sealed and includes a customizable AF lock button, as well as a custom switch. By default, Mode 1 allows the focus dial to operate just as you would expect. But switching over to Mode 2 will allow you to control the aperture instead, effectively turning it into a manual aperture dial. The Zeiss, on the other hand, is made mainly from metal, which is also dust and moisture resistant. Though when it comes to manual buttons and switches, this lens is a bit like my performance in the bedroom, severely lacking. In terms of price in the UK, there really isn't much separating these two lenses, but in the US, the Zeiss is considerably more expensive, which is pretty shocking considering that the Zeiss only has a maximum aperture of f1.8, whilst the Samyang has one of f1.4, and typically in the world of lenses, you pay through the nose for wider maximum apertures. So needless to say, in my opinion, that makes the Samyang the better value for money option, and therefore it gains an early point in this competition. For build quality, I think both lenses deserve a point here as they're both very nicely put together. However, when it comes to scoring for handling, it does get a little bit more tricky to hand out the points. Now, although the Samyang is larger and heavier, it is still very lightweight for an f1.4 lens. Plus, the customizable button and switch are certainly going to be welcome additions for any photographers who like to modify their gear to suit their own shooting style. However, the Zeiss is noticeably smaller. It's so small you can actually fit it in your jeans pocket if you wanted to, but at the very least it's going to take up much less room in your camera bag. Plus, you could argue that the metal finish is going to make it a bit more rugged. So clearly, each of these lenses has their own sets of pros and cons, so in which case I'm just going to award them both a point in this contest and let you decide which option suits your requirements. When it comes to autofocus, in good lighting conditions, both lenses are quick and accurate to focus with no signs of hunting. In low light conditions, both lenses continue to lock on focus without any issues at all. Now, when shooting a moving target wide open in continuous mode, the overwhelming majority of the photos we captured with both of these lenses were pin sharp and in focus, with just a handful that were very marginally misfocused, mainly as George got closer to the camera. So with performances that are just too close to call an overall winner, I think both lenses deserve points apiece in this round. When shooting a moving target in video mode, unfortunately both of these lenses had their issues. The 55mm managed to keep up with George as he walked towards the camera at a regular pace when shooting at f1.8. The Samyang, on the other hand, only managed to keep focus up until the halfway mark, at which point we found that the AF motor just wasn't able to shift fast enough to keep locked onto George. When repeating this test at a faster pace, you can now see that both lenses started to struggle, though you can also see that the Samyang provided the worst results of the two, with results that were just wildly out of focus towards the end of the walk. On the plus side though, both of these lenses are super quiet when it comes to focusing. In manual focus mode, the Samyang's focus ring has quite a heavy resistance to it and a long throw, but it's perfectly usable for performing focus pulls. The Zeiss in comparison was a lot lighter to the touch and had a quicker response, making it the nicer of the two lenses to operate. In terms of focus breathing, the Samyang is the clear winner here as it has no focus breathing at all, whilst the Zeiss suffers quite badly. So after a fairly disappointing result from both of these lenses, I'm quite reluctant to give either of them a point because neither of them are ideal for video work. However, seeing as the Zeiss was able to keep locked onto George when walking at a slow pace at least, and the fast pace wasn't that disastrous, I am going to be generous here and give it a point in this round as it did fare slightly better than the Samyang. In our Bokeh balls test, the Samyang creates the largest orbs of light thanks to its wider maximum aperture of f1.4. When it comes to Bokeh ball shape though, the results are very similar, with both lenses creating round circles in the center that slowly turn into misshapen orbs towards the edges of the frame. One other thing to note is that the Zeiss suffers from an onion ring effect whilst the Samyang doesn't have this problem at all. In terms of general Bokeh bokeh quality, both lenses produce a nice softly focused area, though if I was being super picky, I would have to say that the Samyang offers a slightly softer bokeh. So in this round, that means the Samyang takes the point for bokeh. On a lens flare test, the Zeiss appears to handle ghosting slightly better than the Samyang, which is more washed out in comparison. Though, as usual, both lenses do come included with lens hoods in the box to help shade the front element in harsh lighting conditions, which definitely should help to reduce the effects of flaring. On a longitudinal chromatic aberration test, both lenses feature teal fringing at the top, whilst the fringing turns to a red or amber fringe below the area of sharp focus. Now, when it comes to capturing real-life images, both of these lenses are fantastic options to choose from. Personally, I would always instinctively opt for an f1.4 prime lens over an f1.8, but that's just because I'm a sucker for shooting portraits wide open and creating a super shallow depth of field. However, as these images show, there really isn't that much difference between f1.4 and f1.8, especially when shooting at 50mm. So I didn't really feel that at any point the Zeiss was lacking behind versus the Samyang. Now, because I have big hands, I'm also a fan of big, chunky lenses, as I just find them way easier to operate. Though I also hate using heavy glass, which is usually something that goes hand in hand with wide aperture primes. So you can imagine how happy I was to handle the Samyang, because not only does it tick the box for being big and chunky, but it's also very lightweight for an f1.4 lens as well, and it feels really nicely balanced on the front of my Sony a7 Mark III. However, if you prefer smaller lenses, the Zeiss is pure perfection. It's super compact and the rugged metal build just oozes high quality. But which of these lenses is the best when it comes to image quality? Well, when shooting at the lens's respective maximum apertures, the Zeiss is slightly sharper than the Samyang at the center. At the corners, the Zeiss is now way sharper than the Samyang, which in comparison is noticeably soft. The Samyang does have the advantage of being able to focus slightly closer than the Zeiss at the minimum focusing distance, though when we zoom into the center, you can see that they're pretty much on par in terms of sharpness, despite the Samyang now showing a touch of colored fringing. So it appears that in terms of image quality, the Zeiss just has the edge over this new Samyang, so it deserves the final point in this round. However, I am going to give the Samyang half a point because it really wasn't that far behind its competitor when it comes to overall image quality. And that means after tallying up the scores, the Samyang just takes the win by half a point. But if half a point isn't a decisive enough victory for you, then be sure to let me know which of these lenses you would go for in the comments below, and I'll see you again in the next video.